Doing fantastic, bud. How about yourself?
Can't complain. Living the dream. I see you have your colors on today.
I just happen to like blue. It's pure coincidence.
Yeah, you got your haircut too.
Well, the moisture just makes my hair go so frizzy. I look like a 1980s music video.
All right, so I'm sure everybody is on by extension. We have 24 participants on this town hall, Zoom town hall with MLA Searle Turton. First off, thank you very much for joining us this lunch hour and giving up your power lunch to join us. Today is my first town hall Zoom, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the Greater Parkland Regional Chamber to welcome MLA Searle Turton. Just a couple quick housekeeping pieces. If you wouldn't mind, put yourself on mute. And so if you have any questions, please put that in the question and answer box. Sarah Perriand will be able to facilitate some of those questions and maybe ask some of the questions. We have received a number of questions, 5 to be exact. And so we'll ask those and field any questions. So for our agenda, for the next slide, Sarah. So our agenda is, we'll just talk a little bit about the chamber, but really today is about an update and an opportunity for Searle to give us 15 minutes of what he's doing and how can we help each other, and really dedicated to the 40 minutes of question and answers. And then we'll do a review and a close after that. So on that note, let's begin. So first off is the Greater Parkland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Who are we? We are the Greater Parkland Regional Chamber of Commerce representing Spruce Grove, Stony Plain, and Wabamun districts. Spruce Grove and Stony is where Searle focuses his efforts on. What we do, we advocate, we promote, and we operate a visitor center right in our facility. Why do we do this? Which really is embedded in our purpose. And that is to promote business interest of the region defined by our board and our members. How do we do it? We certainly operate on our core values. These core values were driven from the work of the task force and really embedded into how we, as the new unified voice of the tri-region. And those are based on growth. We're focused on growth. Obviously a little tough right now in terms of where the economy is, but there is growth when there's obviously some little hope. Accountability, we hold ourselves to the higher degree in terms of accountability. We will do and say what we do, and that really follows up by how we treat each other in terms of respect. And I think the value around that is around collaboration, how we work well together, not only as industry, but also as a community within the tri-region. Today is about communication. So, sorry, if you can go back. Yes, thank you. Today is about communication. And one of the quotes that I always go to is a quote by John Adair. And he says, communication is the sister of leadership. Communication is the sister of leadership. With that collective wisdom, one of the things that we come together as a board and as membership is a collective voice really starts to really talk about what do we need to do and how we leverage that wisdom to come to the right path. And that comes with leadership and how we operate in terms of integrity. And this is more of a visioning statement when we sort of where we're going, and we as a board is really looking at it. And so our vision and brand promise is to be recognized as a trusted source and business voice for our members in the tri-region. And it's been about 5 months now since the unification of the tri-region, and I have to say we're actually hitting momentum. And if I could sum it up really in words, we are an organization that is purpose-driven, membership-supported, and values-based. So with that, I'd like to welcome Searle to the platform, and Searle, away with your words, sir.
Awesome, and so thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me out here today, and thank you to in essence, the Greater Parkland Regional Chamber of Commerce for allowing this opportunity. I'm sure as everyone looked outside and saw the rain coming down, this is one of those few opportunities where we're happy to be, meeting in a format like this. And no one wants to see me when I've been in the rain. My hair goes all frizzy. It looks like a 1980s music video, which, as many of you probably have that issue. So, but just to tell you a little bit about some of the difficulties that we're having as a province, some of the solutions that we're going forth, and then obviously to answer your questions, which is actually a real critical part for me to kind of get your feedback. So, first of all, I just kind of wanted to stress some of the difficulty as a province that we are currently in right now. Right now, as a province, we are hit with two events. Each event by itself is worthy of making the history books in terms of a once in a century type of event. Number one, we have our oil price, I would say catastrophe or crisis. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then as well as the largest pandemic since 1918 and the Spanish flu. Either one of these events would be are once in a century type of a predicament. And so to have Alberta right in the middle of both of them happening at the exact same time, it's truly an extraordinary time. And so I've been very thankful, to be able to get the feedback from the business community, from various stakeholders here in Spruce Grove and Stony Plain to help our government continue to make decisions to hopefully steer us through these crises. So I guess first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about oil, and I'm sure most of your questions will be about COVID, but I do have to talk a little bit about oil prices. Um, the what we're currently going right now in terms of an energy situation here in the province is unprecedented. In the middle of December, for example, we were looking at prices of oil at close to $65 a barrel. Our last budget that we put forth was an extremely conservative, guess or prediction in terms of what those oil prices would be. We actually went high 50s. I think approximately $57 a barrel. We showed a flat line price for over the next couple of years. We were not making our budgetary decisions, based in a similar fashion as previous governments, where we were hoping an oil boom was going to somehow make our troubles go away. To see oil prices drop to 10 and 20, and even for some petroleum-based products at zero, is unprecedented. This is the equivalent, for example, of going to Newfoundland and saying you can't fish, or going to Saskatchewan and saying anything that you grow in agriculture, yeah, you can't do that anymore. Energy is by far our largest sector, and to see it decimated in the fashion that it has been this spring, mostly due to the crisis or to the posturing between Saudi Arabia and Russia, I mean, has had effects that have been absolutely unprecedented, and there's no way that anyone could forecast it. I mean, I am pleased to see that some oil prices are coming up, but our government and senior members of our government and ministries have said, oil prices have forsaken the residents of Alberta twice over the last couple of years, after 2008 and obviously this spring. So we are looking forward to having a robust conversation about what does that look like in terms of how do we provide programs and services to Albertans amidst the budgetary crunch that we have. So we could have an entire session just on that, but I'm going to start getting into the secondary issue that we're dealing with, and that has to deal with COVID. Now, I did have a PowerPoint presentation made out. We've had a couple renditions, but unfortunately, at the speed at which our government has been rolling out announcements and giving out tips and suggestions to business owners and other stakeholders in the province, any PowerPoint presentation we have is outdated. So even the one that I had, the most recent one, I can only use about half of it because already we're past it. So I'm going to touch on some of the highlights. I'm sure many of the members will have additional questions for me afterwards. So really to kind of talk a little bit, it seems like forever ago, but I really want to bring us back to March 5th. And if you remember, it was about that time that the Edmonton Oilers were in a playoff run, schools were in sight, or schools were still continuing, and COVID was just a random disease that was coming out of certain areas in China. And over a span of just a couple short days, I think everyone would agree that here in Alberta, our entire life has been turned completely upside down. There was a real fear in terms of when we were looking at the stories and cases in Spain and Italy, seeing escalating numbers. I think there's some people that have a misconception that this may be overblown, and I want to assure people that it absolutely was not. There were jurisdictions all around the world that had their healthcare systems completely overwhelmed. Italy, for example, was pulling 80-year-olds and over off ventilators to give them to younger patients because they did not have enough medical equipment. I mean, when you see even some of the cases, for example, of mass graves that are happening down in Brazil, for example, right now, I mean, that was the situation we were looking at when we started seeing the escalating rates of infection around the world. And so we had to act as quickly as possible. So Alberta, we did our AHS, we did see that there was a potential looming health crisis coming. And that's why we started stockpiling PPE. And so we were well stocked for our frontline services. And we also, as many of you know, put in one of the most aggressive testing measures in the world, really. Alberta was matching South Korea when it came to per capita testing. Now, the reason why this is so important is because it really allowed us to be able to find out your network, find out who potentially you could have infected with COVID, and then be able to let and notify those people so that they can go into quarantine and isolation and try to stop the spread. The interesting thing with COVID is that you can actually have COVID, can be infecting people around you, and not show any symptoms. And that's really what made COVID differently from other types of influenza strains. So, for example, if you get influenza, it could be a matter of hours later, you're already showing symptoms. COVID is a little bit different, and that's why the infection rates were so quick. So, because of the action from AHS, and then with the fast testing and with the quarantine sessions, as everyone knows, we took measures to be able to shut down schools. We wanted to be able to limit that type of exposure, and really it was because of the I won't say dedication, but the ability for Albertans to really embrace their social, I guess, conscience for keeping their fellow neighbors and family members safe by ensuring that they follow the health orders put forth by Dr. Dina Hinshaw, that we have actually been able to successfully flatline the curve or flatline infections, and now we're starting to reopen the economy. So as many of you know, and many businesses I already see are open, is that really last week, I believe it was, we started our stage one relaunch. Now, stage one, to kind of give a quick recap, it's not a complete wide open check in terms of what they can actually do or what businesses can actually open. So some of the businesses I have here for stage one, some retail businesses, personal services, hairstylists. I will admit I don't really attend that many hairstylists, but many people tell me it's pretty important. We opened up a lot more scheduled surgeries and dental procedures, chiropractors, and obviously some limited openings for restaurants and cafes, obviously based upon the 50% capacity. Now, this was not wide open across the entire province, and as it was a very hard decision that we had to make, as a cabinet, as a caucus. But obviously, Calgary and Brooks are on a slightly different path. The largest rates of infection have taken place in those two communities. So, really, based upon the advice of Dr. Dina Hinshaw, we made the decision to have Calgary and Brooks on a bit of a staggered stage one relaunch. So they are going to be staying in the pre-launch stage for a couple extra days just to make sure that the rates of infection in those two respective communities continue to stay down. And then is our hope and desire that after the 10-day period, that those two communities will be able to, catch up with the rest of the province and offer goods, products, and services to the residents at large. So in terms of stage two, that's one of the biggest questions that I get is that when are we expected to get for stage, or when are we looking at stage two? Now, obviously, whatever I say, it's really important to be able to constantly go back to alberta.ca. Any information I give is going to be outdated within 2 hours by the next report that Dr. Dina Hinshaw does at 3:30. So if you have specific questions about what the Alberta government is doing, please look at alberta.ca. If you have questions about specific businesses, about if they can open or not, I recommend that you send an email to bizconnect as many of you already have. So many of you contact me asking questions about essential services. How can you get extra information about your specific, your business or sector? So if you contact the BizConnect website or email, then they can actually get you the information. So in terms of stage 2, as I said, to all the appropriate sandbagging, is that we're looking potentially at middle of June. So we still have a couple more weeks in this stage. We really want to make sure that the rates of infection continue to get hammered down. And so the middle of June is arbitrary at this point. Obviously, it could change upon advice of Dr. Dina Hinshaw. But trust me, as I know many of you are business owners on the Zoom meeting today, I know you guys want to have your businesses open sooner than later, but we really want to make sure that people remain safe. And one of the amazing things about this crisis is that when you look at all the different examples right around the planet, like you have, examples in Sweden, in Japan, in China, in Taiwan, in Singapore, and all the different states in the United States, is that you can see all different variations of different strategies. Some have worked, some haven't. An example that has been referenced many times is the island of Hokkaido. That's our sister province in Japan. They were hit originally by a very large outbreak of COVID. They locked everything down, and then they decided to open up everything wide open. While the rates of infection, a second wave kicked in, even worse than the first wave. And so then they had to even come down harder the second time to clamp down businesses and schools. And obviously, that isn't something we want. If we I can understand, and I think most business owners would attest, is that we can realize and understand if a business gets shut down, but if we get started up, we want to stay started up. We don't want to have this stop go. And so that's why we want to just be a little bit extra cautious, make sure that Albertans are safe, make sure that when we open up businesses, that we're going to continue to move down that path to a full stage 3 recovery. So at this point, regarding stage 3 and additional stages, it's too soon to tell at this point, just based upon, again, it's all based upon Dr. Dina Hinshaw. We're obviously relying upon her expert advice in terms of when is a safe time to be able to open up businesses and different sectors here in the economy. I will say that a lot of parents have contacted me asking me about schools, and Mr. LaGrange has been pretty clear that schools are not expected to be opened up for this year. We're wanting to make sure that we can hammer down any potential rates of COVID infection so that students can go back in September. I don't think anyone would want us to open up a little bit earlier, see the rates of infection increase, which could potentially jeopardize students going back to school. As a parent with 2 small kids, that's definitely not something I want. And we really want to make sure that our kids are safe when they go back to the school system in September, and that we can. There isn't a fear of an extra flare or a second wave coming around that case. I think that's about it in terms of openings and businesses. I guess I want to say before I turn it over to general question and answer period, is I appreciate the comments and suggestions that many members of the business community have told me via email, Facebook message. These are the types of information points that help me when I'm meeting with Minister Shandro, meeting with the rest of cabinet, that I can take into the legislature and fight on your behalf. And so that's why I appreciate even the opportunity from the Greater Parkland Regional Chamber of Commerce to allow me to be able to talk with you, tell you a little bit about why we're making the decisions that we are, so you kind of understand a little bit more about the philosophies that we're using when we make these very, very difficult decisions. And then hopefully it will better enable you and educate you and allow you to provide better products and services to many of your customers. So at that point, Mr. Chair, I'm willing to turn it over and take any questions that anyone may have.
Great, thank you very much, MLA Turton. I agree with you with regards to the oil prices. I think the lack of a national policy, energy policy, is a challenge for us, and I think we need to get that done at the provincial level. Obviously, advocating for a national energy policy would be a good thing to do. COVID, it's real. There's some on one side that basically believe that it really is enough, and there's some that are passive about it. So somewhere in between where we need to be. And I appreciate your comments around that. And I agree with you that with all this rain, the farmers are very happy, especially in our region. And your hair will no longer be frizzy. So the matter of question and answer going forward is Sarah's going to ask some questions that has come through the forum. I've got a number of questions here as well, so we'll just kind of alternate, Sarah, if that's okay. And MLA Turton, you can answer those questions. So the first question is around temporary layoff extension, severance, and vacation pay. Several companies in the Greater Parkland region are not in position to shoulder this cost of severance and vacation pay at the risk of bankruptcy. For one company in particular, this could mean up to 600 plus people could be out on permanent layoff. So the question is, what can the provincial government do to help save these jobs and keep this industry and these companies, and by extension, the economy, stable? MLA Turton?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So that is actually an exact point that has been communicated to us by the Association of the Chambers of Commerce around the province. And this is a perfect example of one of those small gaps that we're working with our business community to be able to take care of. The immediate pressure point for the government when this was all coming down was really make sure a life and limb, that people and Albertans are safe. I mean, there was an immediate threat to their physical health we had to address. Now we kind of took care of the working with the federal government, and I will give kudos to the federal government for CERB checks, for example. They've really stepped up to be able to offer that types of support. And really the province's role, when we're talking amongst the caucus, is to make sure that the gaps, like the ones that you're talking about, are addressed. And we realize that when we put forth a blanket policy or a blanket set of legislation, there's always going to be gaps. And so I know in a similar question, I know there was, for example, there was some legislation that came out that said that the province would honor like the 90-day for layoff notices for hospitality workers. And it was actually business members here in Spruce Grove and Stony Plain that reached out to me, restaurant owners specifically, and said, well, they laid off their staff, because the restaurants were shutting down just before that cutoff. And so they weren't able to take advantage of some of the supports by the provincial government. And it was just last week that because of that exact specific comments that I was able to send up to the Minister of Labor, is that we were actually able to tweak the legislation through an orders of council and then make it to 120 days, I believe it was, so that now a lot of those restaurant owners that were proactive in making sure that their employees were safe, by shutting down just a couple days earlier, we're able to take the same, reap the same benefits per se as someone that stayed open a little bit later. So on that specific note that you talked about, Richard, I don't have an exact point, but I know it's still in discussion, and we're hoping for an announcement very, very soon to kind of take care of that very critical gap.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, did you have a question you would like to, from the audience?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions that have been submitted by Deputy Mayor Linda Mattis of the town of Stony Plain. And she is asking, given the high escalating debt levels and reduced global economic growth, our governments will likely experience debt crisis or significant pressures over this decade. So the first question is, what reforms would help to reduce the burden for Alberta in terms of fiscal stabilisation, equalisation formulas? Also, is the provincial government considering other programme options, for example, the use of the disaster financial assistance to support our province and municipalities through this pandemic?
Awesome. And thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Councillor Mattis, for your question. I always appreciate your thoughtful, insightful questions. So she is absolutely correct, is that it is actually a looming economic crisis, another one. But in terms of, as everyone knows, there's been additional supports both from the province as well as the feds. And there's going to be the real concern is like, where does the money come from? And while the federal government, let's be honest, they have a printing press. They can literally print money or make money with a push of a button. The province, we don't have that ability. And so when it comes to conversations like Councillor Mattis said in terms of equalization, we're locked into our current formula for about, and I believe another 5 years. The previous government signed a long-term agreement locking us into the mid 2020s. So there's really no ability to influence or change that agreement. I personally have massive concerns with it when it comes to equalization formulas tied to resource revenue, but that's a question that will have to be discussed at a future time. But it does, though, raise an interesting question. The Premier has said many times in many of his responses is that there will be a day of reckoning. We understand that we are in unprecedented times. There's an absolute unprecedented amount of support coming from, the provincial government, from the federal government, but it has to come from somewhere. And, I'll use this example, like business owners, you can only spend the credit card so much before eventually that minimum payment gets a little bit too big, and then you have to start cutting back on some other kinds of aspects. And so that is why the Premier struck our Economic Advisory Committee with some of the brightest minds, I think, from an economics perspective, to be able to begin that conversation, but from a long-term perspective, is that, how does the revenue makeup of how the province takes in revenue, how does that look up? And I know many people have contacted me about the resource roller coaster, for example. I mean, over in the last 10 years or so, we've had like 2 massive dips. Is that appropriate? I personally don't think so. I'd like to look at different options, but I mean, that's a very robust conversation. And so as a government, as a caucus, we are having that discussion right now. Our deficit in this year alone is probably projected to be close to $20 billion, just with the amount of support that we've given to Albertans. Everything from backstopping loans to additional support for laid off workers, to trying to create additional supports to prevent businesses from going under. I mean, to give an example, the town of Banff, in a 10-day period, in I think it was March or beginning of April, a population of 9,000 people, and a span of 10 days, they had over 5,000 layoffs. That is one town, and that same example has been spread through countless communities throughout the entire province. And so a lot of those people have additional needs for either food bank or mental health supports. They're obviously going to be using FCSS. So this week, for example, I know as many of you saw on Facebook, I was highlighting a couple additional grants given out to local organizations that are doing some additional work due to COVID and helping the residents in this area. But it is a great question. We're having that discussion right now. But I do think as business owners and community leaders, we're going to have to come to the realization that eventually the money tree is going to run out. Like between our revenue bottoming out with energy, and then with the extra costs incurred because of COVID, it's going to be tough from a budgetary perspective moving forward to provide the same level of service, because the government only has 3 options: raise taxes, cut spending, or go into debt. And if you go into debt, you're kicking the can down the road, and eventually you're going to have to deal with that. So if you're dealing with a $20 billion deficit, it's going to be some hard decisions moving forward.
All right, so MLA Turton, I know we get a lot of questions here. I think what I got
I'll try to break it down.
Comment is that the day of reckoning will be coming. I think what people are asking really is these exceptional times that require, when we talk about equalization, municipalities need to survive, and so I think we really need to look at those within those, our businesses within those communities. So really around that piece. So there is a 5-year understanding or agreement, into mid 2020s, but perhaps there's an opportunity for that to reopen in some form. I do have another question. The question really is around other provinces have helpful tax credit regimes, such as Ontario Innovation Tax Credit, Ontario Business Research Institute Tax Credit, that encourages in research and development and entrepreneurship by helping companies invest deeper into startups' new ideas. These build already successful programs like Shred Credit at the federal level. The question for you is, what plans does this government have to use credits tax credits or similar to make Alberta more inviting for innovative startups and high-tech businesses?
So thank you for the question. So really, it's been it was a campaign commitment that we gave last year. Is that we were going to take a departure where some other provinces were, and as well as the previous government, by removing or reducing the amount of boutique tax credits to specific sectors. Instead, we made a commitment to drop our corporate tax rate from 12% to 8% over 4 years. This move alone has made Alberta one of the best environments, and from a tax perspective, in North America, to have a business. And it was that tax credit, for example, that started off, for example, a wind power renewable energy boom down in southern Alberta with a number of permits coming in as per CanWe. So really our philosophy has been, we want to give all sectors across the board an ability to reap the benefits of a low tax environment and to bring their business here versus picking winners and losers. And there's been countless times where governments, especially the Alberta government, has picked the wrong horse in the race per se. And so by putting our tax rate currently to 10%, and with an extra intention to drop it even lower, that's going to give those new startups a better opportunity to be able to have their business here. So that seems, or that is the direction our government's taking. And I think from the business community as a whole, it's been fairly well received.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, we've got a question that's come in from the audience, very simply. Are you planning a provincial sales tax?
All options are on the table.
No, that's a very good question. Searle?
All options are on the table. I mean, obviously no decisions have been made, but I mean, it's a very complex subject. Like I said, you only have 3 options: raise taxes, cut spending, go into debt. Really, it comes down to those 3 things. And when you have a quarter of your provincial revenue, or one of the biggest sources of your provincial revenue, get torpedoed because of low oil prices, the question obviously, and that should come up, is like, well, how do we make that up in terms of lost revenue sources? So all I can say is that there's discussions right across the spectrum happening, and everyone has an opinion on it. And I look forward to seeing those discussions roll out over the next couple months.
So the short answer is all options are on the table. Yep. All right, Sarah, did you have another question?
Yes, there's one. You actually spoke a little bit about it earlier on, and the question is, initially the guidelines that were created to protect our healthcare system from being overwhelmed, and it has become clear that not only has the healthcare system not been overwhelmed, but the absolute opposite is true. I'll miss out the middle. Go to the actual question. Why has the government not completed a course, corrected its course to address the other issues that now are more significant than the COVID-19 issue? And that was a question submitted by one of our members.
What are the other issues that the other members, I guess they don't say?
They don't.
Okay, well, I'll give them maybe a chance to type and re-clarify just a little bit of that second part. In terms of the first part, when you go back to March, like I said, and I have received questions like, the initial predictions that Dr. Dean Hinshaw and the epidemiologists were saying didn't pan out. It was an overreaction. But at the time, when you looked at mass graves in Italy being overwhelmed, you looked at death counts increasing across some of the most sophisticated healthcare systems on the planet, and then you see the rapid rise of infection in very developed countries. We're not talking about, like obscure countries that maybe have less sophisticated healthcare systems. We're talking some of the top healthcare systems, and we're getting completely overwhelmed. And so that, based upon that reality at the time, I mean, when we were doing the budget at the time, I believe there was over, I think, 12 or 13 MLAs that were in self-quarantine at that point as well. So, I mean, there was a real concern, and I think grounded at the time is that if we don't act quickly, we will follow the same path as all these other countries that unfortunately didn't make the decisions that we did early enough. And so that's why we clamped down harder earlier in the cycle compared to what other countries did. And that is the reason why we're at the level that we are today, and not with the type of death counts that they have in certain European countries or in Brazil or in Russia. So I don't think it was overrated. I think there'll be a lot of navel gazing afterwards, and armchair quarterbacks and analysts that say, well, you should have done this, you should have done that. But when you're in a leadership position, you have to make the decision with the best information you can at that time. You don't have the hindsight to jump ahead 3 months and look back and make a decision based upon that. And I stand by the decisions that our government has made, and I'm very thankful that Dr. Hinshaw made the decisions that she did to keep our residents safe.
Thank you, MLA Turton. So a question really comes from a pre-question that said, the fact that many businesses have had to move to working from home has demonstrated that many organizations, the severe and deep problem of internet capacity, as you can see, some of it a bit of a challenge, specifically in rural and suburban areas. The question is, does the government have any sort of plan or initiative to encourage businesses, both large like TELUS, but also small and agile like YBAN, to expand and improve their internet capacity so that businesses that are not located centrally in urban regions can have the to work from home policy that works as COVID continues? And I think this is really about how we elevate the connectivity through proper band usage. So your comment, please.
Yeah, it's a good question from a philosophical perspective. We have talked about as caucus, many times, saying, like, if you were a large business downtown Edmonton, for example, and you had 3 months of your staff working at home, the question you're going to ask yourself is that, why are we paying for 26 stories of leasable office space in a large tower when we can have 3/4 or 60% of our staff work at home and get to the same levels of productivity? And so I think this has really showcased the changing of the times in terms of allowing people that ability to work at home, but it does create gaps in the system in terms of internet connectivity. I know the city of Spruce Grove has a broadband strategy, for example, that is talking about connecting commercial areas and perhaps the industrial park. I was very happy to support that initiative when I was on council. But I think it also raises the larger question about, should we be having conversations about building code changes, for example, to allow a high-speed fiber optic cable to be out to residential areas, for example, so that more home-based businesses can exist at home. We see, for example, I'm sure every one of us has had Zoom meetings collapse because everyone's using the internet during the day when they typically wouldn't. And so I think that this is probably a precursor to a larger societal change that'll take place in terms of maybe having people do more of their work and play at home versus large centralized businesses. But we haven't had the ability yet to have that conversation to the level of detail that you're talking about, Richard.
All right, thank you. We've got about 10 more minutes, and there's a lot of questions, and I'll go over to Sarah for a question. Okay,
where are we? Do you believe that it was sound judgment to pass through the spring budget without serious debate? Detailed discussion usually takes place, but because of the fear that the ledge was going to be shut down, it appears that the government rushed it through.
I stand by the decision that we had the, in the manner that we pushed for the budget. All private members had the ability to ask any minister or department individual questions, and I do on a regular basis, even outside of the regular budgetary process. We gave the opposition ample opportunity to have hours and hours of debate in the legislature, and even during estimates to ask their questions. I mean, prior to the budget being being passed in the legislature, I mean, one department that I was in charge of, or not in charge of, but asking questions, I was involved in a 6-hour debate for that one ministry alone. in estimates beforehand. So I think that anyone that says it was somehow rushed through without adequate levels of debate, I think those individuals might not be aware of the process that actually did take place and how many hours and days were spent debating on that. But also just to kind of touch base is that during the budget, we like I said, we had countless MLAs that were in lockdown and quarantine. And really, here's the thing as well, is that we wanted to make sure that we gave the confidence to our healthcare system or education system that they had the funds that they needed to do their next year's worth of work. If we would have delayed the budget, then there was no crystal ball saying what the status of the province or the country would have been in 2, 3, 4 months. It would have left so many providers of those programs and services, municipalities, wondering when is their next funding conversation going to be. Like they wouldn't be able to plan. So we wanted to give that faith to our community or to our partners that we work with and say, look, here's your funding. We went to our education system. Here's your funding. You can now go for the next year with that. And then that way we can take care of the immediate crisis of COVID at the time. And many of the community organizations that I dealt with were thankful that now they have their 1 year's worth of funding. They didn't have to worry about it. So when everyone went to the respective lockdowns, they knew that the government had ensured that their funding was there. If we would have delayed that 4 or 5 months, it would have created a lot of unnecessary certainty for a lot of people around the entire province.
Thank you. In the respect out of people's time, I think we've got about 5 or 6 more minutes. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If we do not answer all your questions, we'll give MLA Turton an opportunity to answer those. But keep in mind, we'll have more of these. This is our first town hall Zoom meeting, and we'll have more of these as a part of the series. So if we can't get to your questions here today, know that it's actually sparked a lot of questions, but it's really about connecting. So if we can get to your questions, please call in, email both the chamber as well as MLA Turton for those questions. So with that, Sarah, did you have any other questions?
Yes, it actually relates back to the question from a few moments ago. Were other models considered, such because of the question related to a potential overreaction to COVID-19, and we've seen increased suicides, we've seen increased domestic violence as a result of unemployment. So the question actually centers around, were other models considered when the government made the decision to go into lockdown?
Yes, numerous models were considered, and at the end of the day, our chief medical officer, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, was the one that, as the chief, health authority in the province, she made the decision based upon her expertise, and upon the advice of the experts around her to follow the path that we did. So it was based strictly upon evidence.
Great. I think we still have room for 1 more question, Sarah.
I don't see any more in the chat box. I know that Councillor Mattis had a second part to her question, but I do think that you've answered. Let's just go back to it. I think, so what hard budget choices do you see Alberta having to make post-crisis to get out of this multi-level oil and health-led economic downturn?
Well, I mean, to bring it, really shrink down the discussion and to get down to brass tacks, like I said, it really comes down to 3 things. Again, I mentioned before: increasing revenue through increased taxes, cutting spending, and going further into debt, which is just delaying the problem. Like, that's really what it comes down to. And so all I can say at this point is that we're still having the discussions as a caucus, as a government, and I'm sure, and the Premier's already started to set the stage for to the public in terms of saying, like, the day of reckoning is coming. We're going to have to be able to deal with this reality that we're in. And so I think it's it's causing a lot of Albertans to have that discussion about, how do we pay for programs and services? How does that financial pie get made up? And we're going to be reaching out, obviously, to a lot of people in terms of getting their feedback. And I think it's one of those once in a generational type discussions that I think is personally overdue here in the province. And I'm very thankful to be able to be at the table, and take a lot of the feedback from members of Spruce Grove and Stony Plain with me as we have that discussion.
All right, thank you, MLA Turton. Would you get the last word to say thank you, and we'll close, and I'll close.
Perfect. No, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everyone for coming here today and listening to me while you sit and eat your sandwiches and lunches. I will admit I'm a little hungry right now, but thank you for this opportunity, and it's long overdue to have this conversation. I look forward to having potentially some additional meetings like this just to be able to answer the questions. Hopefully you come out a little bit more educated and understanding about some of the larger philosophical issues that we're dealing with as a government, but while philosophical in nature, we realize that there's real nuts and bolts effects that it has on residents and businesses here in Spruce Grove and Stony Plain. I would ask that if you have any additional information questions, feel free to check out my Facebook page. I try to post all the information on there as quickly as I can. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me. I do my best to answer everyone that sends us an email or question. And I look forward to continuing to serve this amazing area that I call home. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Turton. I appreciate your involving the Chamber of Commerce in every opportunity to advocate and to share the voice. We are governed by or at least give our directions from our members, and the members both on the business side. And so I think we share the same principles when we talk about the three things you talk about, which is raise taxes. For us, of course, is to increase revenue, to increase liquidity. When we talk about cut spending, I think we all have to do those things. And I think we talk about going to debt. Well, going to debt is one thing, but obviously in some cases, some businesses may not be able to go in debt because they don't have the means to do that. So with that, I'll close. And if we could have the next slide on there, Sarah. So the next slide really just talks about, last one. So for more information that you're looking for from the Chamber, please, we encourage engagement with us. It's really important to share your thoughts and ideas, but I think it's more important to actually have some action around it. And so accountabilities in our value system is around what are we going to do about it. So I think this is a really good start. Thank you to everybody who actually participated. With 25 participants today, and so we'll send out some of the notes if you'd like, or at least field some of the questions. And for those questions that you're thinking about asking, please send them to the Chamber, and we'll be happy to relay them to the order. One of the key strengths of the Chamber is advocacy, so advocating for what is the business voice of the Tri-Region. On that note, please stay tuned for further information. Check out the new website, the new Greater Parkland Regional Chamber website, which was a big credit to the staff. Awesome, what a transition. Just like we are as a board of directors, we are transitioning and we're working for you. Have a good day, stay out of the rain, and keep well. Thank you.